So I just want to kind of show you all how the sausage of faith gets made. Or at least argued for. I see two problems with what you just did, and okay. Perhaps you're aware of them. One is that Maimonides actually said that this could not be understood allegorically or in any other way, but literally he came back 25 years later after he had been misunderstood in the Guide to the Perplexed and wrote, I think in his commentary to the Mishnah, that the resurrection is a literal truth, has to be believed in. There may be some caveats there in his theology, but he was talking about bodies being reanimated. The other issue is you made this sort of artful move to the free will loophole. You said people have free will. If a man wants to lock his daughter in a dungeon and have sex with her, God has allowed that because he's given us this rather diabolical freedom. That doesn't cover all of the other suffering for which only God can be responsible if he exists. The 9 million children I just talked about dying every year. Through cancers and violence and accidents and lack of access to clean water, and this is God's fault if God exists. I mean, either he can do nothing about this, or he doesn't care to. So either he's impotent or evil. I mean, this is the problem that the free will doesn't get you out of. But the problem is that most people, most of the time, are desperate to believe ridiculous and divisive ideas for patently emotional reasons. And while rarely explicit, what they're really worried about is death. And when we're arguing about teaching evolution in the schools, I would argue that we are really arguing about death. It seems to me the only reason why any religious person cares about evolution is because if their holy books are wrong about our origins, they are very likely wrong about our destiny after death. So when you say to someone that you're a fool for not believing in evolution or a fool to think the universe is 6,000 years old, I think that gets translated as you're a fool to think that your daughter who died in a car accident is really in heaven with God. And that is a very different communication. Before I can get to the end of this sentence, something unforeseen and terrible will happen to somebody somewhere. And we will read about it in the newspaper tomorrow. The question is, how can people close to these tragedies make sense of them? And religion provides an answer for that. It's an unjustified answer. It's a bad answer. It's an answer that comes with a host of other liabilities because one being that it has birthed a many competing and irreconcilable answers, and therefore religious conflict and political tribalism seem impossible to overcome. But religion does provide an answer that most people think they need. And the schism among secularists, the fact that so many people at this conference are regularly attacked for criticizing religion, follows from this point. And people are worried about the grief of other people. The scientists and journalists who have made a career out of attacking the so-called new atheists are worried about the grief of other people. There's some confusion here. I think there's a real asymmetry between science and religion that shouldn't go unobserved. And there's an effort on the part of David and Bradley to not own the very clear propositional claims that have been made by every religion for millennia. Claims about the way the universe is structured. Very explicit claims about what's going to happen in the future, about what happened in the past, about what happens after death. And these claims are incompatible. So, for instance, if Buddhism is true, Buddhism purports to be true. Buddhism has a doctrine of karma and rebirth. You can be reborn as an animal. You can be reborn in various realms. If Buddhism is true, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are absolutely false in their core claims. I mean, these are not pictures that can be squared logically. And every religion is in the business of making these claims about the afterlife and about all manner of other things. And the crucial difference between religion and science is that every religion is beholden to its literature and doesn't think, for the most part, apart from the fringe of kind of liberal intelligentsia, for the most part, people don't think it's man-made. They don't think that these are just books. If everyone read the Bible like Shakespeare, Hitch and I would be doing something entirely unrecognizable right now. I mean, there would be no problem. And so the problem we're articulating is everyone has this idea that they have knowledge about the afterlife, the end of days, the virgin birth of certain people, etc. And these are claims to truth, and they are profoundly anti-scientific because you can't edit the books. You can't edit the Quran. You can't edit the Bible. You can't acknowledge freely within the context of the faith that there are just mountains of life-destroying nonsense in these books, and that's a problem. Don't you know that there's going to come a day when you'll be sick or someone close to you will die, and you'll look back on the kinds of things that captured your attention, and you'll think, what was I doing? You know this, and yet if you're like most people, you will spend most of your time in life tacitly presuming you'll live forever. I mean, it's like watching a bad movie for the 4th time. Yeah. Or bickering with your spouse. I mean, these things only make sense in light of eternity. I mean, there better be a heaven if we're going to waste our time like that. So unlike religious people, we atheists really have a good reason to make the most of life, to make the most of the present moment. Because even if you live to be 100, there are just not that many days in life. There's a false assumption about science operating here. Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife, or that the mind is identical to the brain, right, or that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. And if it's true that the consciousness is being run like software on the brain and can, by virtue of ectoplasm or something else we don't understand, can be dissociated from the brain at death, that would be part of our growing scientific understanding of the world if we could discover it. Now, and there are ways we could in fact discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact, they just can't get the words out. Everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces, you can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain, and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another, and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English. Now, David? And I think a much more important point is, if everything you're saying about your religious orientation is true, because you're basically confessing a kind of scientific attitude toward the mysteries of subjectivity and what happens after death, then the usefulness of holding to these traditions and these first-century books I'm completely at a loss. I mean, it seems like you're in the wrong line of work. You should be psychologists.